Welcome back to The Situation, the weekly show that does for humanity what the band on the Titanic did for the drowning passengers. Tries to keep you mildly distracted as civilization slips beneath the waves. I'm Simon, and this week we're back in Somalia. That's right, the same nation that tried to force us into taking down a video through the threat of a frivolous lawsuit. But rather than an update on the case, we're instead zeroing in on a genuine tragedy, the seemingly unstoppable advance of Al-Shabaab, with the terror group now seizing key strategic areas outside of Mogadishu. After that, it's a short hop over to the Middle East, where we report on Iran's attempts to rebuild its proxy networks in Lebanon and Yemen. And finally, we check in on the Congo, where a recent so-called peace deal is turning out to be anything but. Timestamps below if you need them. You don't watch the whole thing, why not? And now, Somalia. Just before we continue, quick word for our sponsor. Getting internet abroad shouldn't involve airport kiosks, physical SIM cards, or whatever that sketchy stand there baggage claim is selling. Oh my, I remember the past. You'd have to have that little key with the a pin, but I'd always lose it, so I'd end up using a safety pin to get the SIM out. When you travel, you'd have to swap them, and then some phones even had dual SIM. Why? We fixed it. Saily is an eSIM app that lets you stay connected in over 190 countries, which is most of them, isn't it? No physical SIM, no swapping cards. You just install once, choose a plan, and you are good to go for every country that you land in. You avoid roaming fees, you stay online the second you land, and you skip the, oh no, where's the Wi-Fi so I can figure it out scavenger hunt. The plans are affordable, you can grab global or regional coverage, and there's even privacy protection features built in, like ad blocking and web protection, to keep your data safer while traveling. I've used it. It's ridiculously easy to use. Just the days of popping those SIM cards out. And look, honestly, before Saily sponsored me, I used another provider that it was a hassle. It was really cool because the final product is you're not getting absolutely destroyed on data charges. But it was really tricky to get it up and running. Saily, none of that. It's just better. You can get an exclusive 15% off Saily data plans. Use the code WarFronts at checkout. Download the app or go to Saily, SAILY.com/WarFronts to start your trip without the SIM card chaos. And now back to today's episode. First up, we turn to the vast, open scrublands of Somalia, where the jihadist terror organization Al-Shabaab continues to gain ground, pushing forward in a brutal offensive against the federal forces of Mogadishu. Now, at the end of July 2025, the group has undone many of the most important victories of a US-backed push to defeat them in 2022, and there's still no sign that the terrorists' momentum will stall anytime soon. The most recent major territorial gains that Al-Shabaab achieved in central Somalia came a couple of weeks ago in two strategically significant townships, Mogadishu and Taro, both in the Somali state of Hirshabelle. The fall of these two towns is significant for several reasons at once, but perhaps most important of all is the fact that the Somali federal government has fought tooth and nail to try and keep them. Mogadishu, in particular, has been the focus of a 2-month-long grinding offensive by Al-Shabaab, where the group fought against not just federal troops, but a collection of smaller militias fighting on behalf of the local population. Those militias, in particular, are typically quite difficult adversaries to defeat in open battle, both because they're very familiar with the terrain where local offensives take place, and because they have far more to lose than the average Somali soldier will at any given time. While the bulk of Somali troops are known to be undermotivated, underpaid, and undertrained, local militias are often the last line of defense between their own families and a marauding terrorist insurgency that may well choose to mark them for death. The ones at Mogadishu, in particular, have been hailed in some circles as Somalia's best weapon against the jihadist threat. So, for Al-Shabaab to break through at Mogadishu after multiple months of high-intensity fighting was a major victory, even by the standards of Al-Shabaab's ongoing offensive. According to local sources, the group ultimately broke through with a pair of coordinated suicide assaults, collectively using several large car bombs and multiple hundreds of gunmen. Against the combined strength of the terrorist assaults, federal defenders and local militias alike were forced to pull back, although for a time the government in Mogadishu claimed that it had successfully defended the town. With skirmishes still ongoing in the outskirts near Mogadishu, Al-Shabaab turned its attention southward to the town of Taro, where again they faced a combined force of local militias and troops from the Somali military. But in this case, The jihadists managed to capture the town without a fight. According to one member of the Somali parliament, a large part of the collapse in government lines was due to the military's failure to send, quoting the Somali Guardian, reinforcements or even basic supplies like water tankers. In the area where the fighting had been heaviest, Al-Shabaab rounded out its territorial capture with the small town of Gamar, marking the first time the jihadists had consolidated control of this zone since 2018. Then, most recently, Al-Shabaab was able to take another pair of strategically important towns in yet another location, this time in an area southwest of Mogadishu in the region of Lower Shabelle. Here, a series of deadly suicide bombings led to the eventual withdrawal of Somalian international peacekeeping forces from the towns of Sabid and Anole, just a month after those areas had been recaptured from a prior Al-Shabaab assault. Those two towns protect a very important river crossing that, if properly defended by Al-Shabaab, will now prevent Somali troops from moving across much of the area south of the capital. With this most recent series of victories, Al-Shabaab is able to put substantial pressure on two key locations, Bulabade and Jalalaksi. Bulabade is a regional transport hub where two major highways come together, and it was last under Al-Shabaab control all the way back in 2014. Its surrounding district has an estimated population of nearly 500,000 people, and possibly even more given the displacement of civilians from areas that jihadists now control. Capture the town and the highway intersection that comes with it, and Al-Shabaab can completely lock down one of the most strategically important ways out of Mogadishu. The city of Jalalaksi is arguably an even bigger prize, as a capture of that area would allow Al-Shabaab to work its way down the highway in question, getting closer and closer to Mogadishu and cutting off federal troops from easily traveling to other vulnerable areas. According to the Long War Journal, Al-Shabaab will most likely try to encircle those two cities in the near term in order to apply pressure and eventually capture them in mass assaults, as they did with Mokokori and Tano during the most recent set of battles. Of course, that's not to say that Somalia isn't fighting back. On the day before Tano fell to the jihadists, a drone strike killed a handful of Al-Shabaab fighters west of Mokokori, while in the last couple of weeks, Somali forces have claimed credit for multiple operations that killed over a dozen Al-Shabaab militants each. But as much as Somali leaders try to tout these counter-terror operations as indicators of their success in combat, they tend to oversell the actual relevance of these sorts of counterattacks. Similar to the Taliban of Afghanistan, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Jinim in the Sahel, Al-Shabaab's status as a jihadist insurgency means that it doesn't think about human casualties in the same way that a proper, non-Russian military would. Although martyrdom is not necessarily an ideal scenario for individual Al-Shabaab fighters, the group operates in a way that happily accepts a degree of personnel losses in order to cause greater damage, take territory, protect finances, weaponry, or senior leadership, or even just lure government forces into ambushes and firefights. Al-Shabaab's number of fighters at any given time is difficult to pin down, but the group is known to be actively recruiting and training personnel in large numbers, and with the way that Al-Shabaab structures its offensives, it's able to easily plug new fighters into a given operation when others are killed off. Put simply, killing Al-Shabaab fighters simply isn't a deterrent to their larger war effort in the same way that wiping out groups of soldiers from a formal military would force that military to reposition or better protect its troops. Again, with the exception of Russia. It's not that Al-Shabaab's fighters are truly expendable. After all, there are still a limited number of them in total, and those with fighting experience and acumen are particularly valuable. But destroying small cells or individual fighting units doesn't interrupt Al-Shabaab's offensive capabilities in the same way that the Somali government's celebration of those small wins might have an observer believe. And because Somalia has to rely on a relatively small number of elite, fast-moving units to launch effective counterattacks against the group, it lacks the ability to mount the kind of large-scale counter-offensive that would really be able to do some damage, either by wiping out militants on the scale of hundreds instead of the occasional dozen, or by attacking the supply and logistical infrastructure that allows Al-Shabaab to sustain its operations. Nor have Somalia's international partners been able to make up the gap. Right now, Somalia is the temporary home for over 10,000 forward-deployed troops for an African Union mission under the acronym AWESOME. But if you'll excuse a cheeky pun, their word has been anything less than awesome in practice. Comprising 4,500 troops from Uganda, 2,500 from Ethiopia, and 1,000 or more from Egypt, Kenya, and Djibouti, respectively, AWESOME is meant to help stabilize Somalia, but its troops have largely taken up defensive positions across the country instead of leading counter-offensives against Al-Shabaab. Not only that, but their deployment comes with multiple controversies, partly because of the fractious relationship between Somalia and participating nation Ethiopia, and partly because of the difficult legacy of past African Union deployments in Somalia. Under Ossam's watch, Al-Shabaab has captured major chunks of territory, carried out at least one nearly successful attempt on the Somali president's life, and deftly avoided the sorts of direct confrontations with African soldiers that might lead to heavy losses. Now, there is a chance that Ossam will play a more important role as Al-Shabaab tightens its hold on Mogadishu. Both of the major targets that are now in Al-Shabaab's sights, Bulabade and Jalalaski, are the locations of bases occupied by fighters from the nearby nation of Djibouti, who will lend additional manpower to fight alongside Somali federal troops. But although Djibouti's soldiers and their equipment could be quite helpful, there are no guarantees that they'd actually get the chance to fight. On the one hand, Al-Shabaab's creative use of encirclements, followed by attritional skirmishes and then massive assaults spearheaded with car bomb detonations, are quite good at forcing defenders into a tactical retreat. It may not make sense for either Somali federal forces or Djiboutian soldiers or local militias to stay and fight under those circumstances, just as it didn't in the recent capture of Tado. And even if a defense of Bulabade or Jalalaski did make sense, there's no guarantee that Djibouti's government wouldn't pull its soldiers from the fight in order to avoid heavy losses for a military with only 20,000 active personnel in total. Just last week, Somalia witnessed another of its partners from Ossam fail to deter Al-Shabaab from taking yet another target, this time in the capture of the towns of Sabid and Anole southwest of the capital, where Ugandan forces were supposed to help hold the line. In those towns, around 35 Ugandan soldiers were killed in multiple suicide attacks, destroying morale at a time when they'd already been fighting without pay for over a year since the US and the European Union paused funding for their deployment. With the retreat of Ugandan forces, a planned, limited counter-offensive in nearby towns became impossible. And while Somalia's international support doesn't exclusively consist of Ossam, its other partners haven't been much more effective. The United States is also active in Somalia, launching airstrikes against jihadist targets, but they're only partially focused on Al-Shabaab. Instead, they're primarily concerned with the Islamic State Somalia branch, who've become a global hub for Islamic State leadership and financial networks from the relative safety of the mountains in autonomous Puntland. America has occasionally lent air support in the fight against Al-Shabaab, but the specifics of those strikes are largely unknown, and according to information that's available in the public domain, they don't appear to have been enough to turn the tide. Turkey also deploys troops in a barracks in Mogadishu, but it's largely handled training operations to help Somali soldiers who don't exactly have a reputation of making those Turkish trainers proud when they actually take that expertise into combat. At home, Turkish leaders have faced domestic pressure to draw down aid expenditures on Somalia, as opposition figures have alleged that aid is being siphoned away by corrupt and well-connected contractors. And as Al-Shabaab captures more and more territory, especially strategically important positions that were supposed to be success stories for the Somali military, internal elements have started to turn their backs on Mogadishu too. Speaking to the AFP, one Somali militant leader described Somalia's current president as being, quote, extremely inept at working with the clans. Somali special forces, known as the Danab Brigades, remain effective at the sorts of isolated one-off counterattacks against Al-Shabaab that we mentioned before, but they too are suffering the effects of attritional warfare, with more and more veteran fighters and officers being taken out of the fight. And as Mogadishu's federal forces start to crumble, the president and his inner circle have been far more focused on playing politics ahead of an election year, working desperately to control the narrative around Somalia's fight, as we're sure you can probably see in the comment section of this very episode. But they're utterly failing to focus on the fight at hand. All the while, Al-Shabaab itself has only grown stronger. The group has taken control of regional economies in much of the central Somali heartland, where it doesn't have to worry about being pushed off its captured territory anytime soon. Speaking to Barron's, researcher Rashid Abdi described the group as, quoting here, one of the wealthiest insurgencies in Africa. As Abdi explained, it outtaxes the state. Its business tentacles spread everywhere. Its ranks are swelling with disillusioned young men, including some army deserters who were enticed not just on religious grounds or for reasons of self-protection, but by Al-Shabaab's better ability to pay and a growing sense that they'll end up on the winning side of the nation's civil conflict. Al-Shabaab's positions are growing ever more defensible. They're able to build bigger and better improvised explosives. They're able to coordinate the sorts of encircling attacks that they favor, and they're poised to hit Mogadishu with destabilizing terror attacks from all directions, quite literally doing what they do best. Just last week, Mogadishu's commander of the nation's prisons indicated that Al-Shabaab is currently planning a coordinated large-scale attack on Mogadishu's central prison, where hundreds of Al-Shabaab fighters are incarcerated, and they could swell the jihadist group's ranks. if they were to be freed. As much as the Somali government may not want to admit it, and trust us, we at WarFronts know exactly how much they don't want to admit it, Al-Shabaab is ascendant right now. Mogadishu does not appear equipped to take back and then hold the territory that they've lost. And if they can't do that, then it's only a matter of time before Al-Shabaab reaches its endgame. And just before we get into the next story today, please do consider subscribing to our absolutely free twice weekly newsletter, which has now reached 10,000 subscribers. Thank you so much, everybody. 10,000 people are enjoying that free newsletter. And if you're not one of them, become one of them by clicking the link below. And let's move on to Iran and its desperate race to rearm its shattered proxy network. Last week, US-backed Yemeni forces made a discovery aboard what appeared to be an ordinary cargo vessel cruising on the Red Sea. Hidden beneath crates of air conditioners lay 750 tons of Iranian weapons, a record-breaking amount that the US Central Command called the largest seizure of advanced Iranian conventional weapons ever made. The cache included hundreds of cruise missiles, anti-ship weapons, drone engines, and targeting components, all bound for the Houthis in Yemen. Among the weapons were Iranian-developed Qadar anti-ship missiles, the same type the Houthis have used to attack merchant vessels in the Red Sea for 2 years, and components for the Saka air defense system, which the insurgents have successfully used to bring down US drones. If there was any doubt left in anyone's mind where these came from, the extensive documentation and quality certificates from Iranian manufacturers for these systems, which was written in Farsi, put them to rest. Not so long ago, such a find wouldn't have been remarkable. For decades, Iran built a network of proxy forces designed to keep its enemies at bay. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen. The thinking was that Iran itself would never face a direct attack because these groups would provide a guaranteed response. But then came October the 7th, the Gaza War, and all its spillover. Spillover which mostly involved Israel systematically dismantling as much of Iran's proxy network as possible. In late 2024, for example, the IDF launched a campaign across southern Lebanon and parts of Beirut aimed at smashing Hezbollah. You probably remember the biggest set pieces of the war, the exploding pages that crippled the organization, the airstrikes that took out Hezbollah commanders in their homes even when they were surrounded by civilians. But this wasn't merely a war of theatrical surprise attacks. The IDF didn't just defeat Hezbollah, it broke the organization in a way few, or let's be honest, nobody would have thought possible. Leader Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated. Subsequent air campaigns destroyed 80% of Hezbollah's rocket arsenal before it could even be fired. By the time Israel launched its ground operation in Lebanon, Hezbollah was finished, forced into a humiliating ceasefire by year's end. Nor were the militants the only ones wiped out. December saw a swift rebel advance topple Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, and while Israel does have problems with the new leadership, the rebels now ruling the country at least don't answer to Tehran. So when Israel launched its strikes against Iran this past June, Tehran was more alone than it had been in decades. While the Houthis provided some missile support from Yemen, this was largely symbolic, and the rockets fired didn't even make it to Israel. Iran would have to face its archenemy alone. Well, as we all saw in real time, Tehran's solitary stand was more like watching an inexperienced boxer get pummeled to the mat by an experienced pro. Tehran's Russian-bought missile defense systems, which had already sustained damage in an earlier exchange with Israel, were little match for the Israeli Air Force's vastly superior stealth technology, which quickly managed to achieve air superiority over every single major Iranian city, including the capital. Undercover spies even began assassinating regime officials in the streets. Sure, some Iranian missiles got through Israeli defenses in retaliation, but honestly, the fighting was pretty one-sided even before America joined the fray. By the end, Iran had received what's best described as a good old-fashioned beatdown. Its weapons stocks were depleted, its proxy forces gone or in ruins. Tehran had finally fought the long-feared war with its greatest enemy, and the enemy had won. All of which brings us back to that Red Sea weapons shipment, and more specifically, the questions it raises. Why would Iran immediately start risking its already depleted weapons stock to rearm proxies who had by all measures failed to come to Tehran's support when the Ayatollah needed them most? And the answer tells us a lot about how Iran's leaders are thinking about their place in the world, and why the Middle East looks increasingly to be on the verge of another round of violence. Let's start with Hezbollah and the sort of existential crisis that they've been going through. This wasn't just a group that lost a war. It's an organization that had increasingly based their reason for existence on something that quite literally went up in a cloud of smoke. One of Hezbollah's founding purposes was resistance to Israel. For its fighters, this isn't politics or strategy, it's a holy war that defines their identity. Think about the psychological impact of their recent defeat. These guys spent decades building up this legendary deterrent, stockpiling thousands of long-range ballistic missiles and other weapons, convinced they were the sole guarantee keeping Israel from dominating the region. Then they watched it all get destroyed in a matter of weeks. The moral crisis here is difficult to overstate. And yet their founding mission means they cannot give up. Admitting defeat would mean that everything they had fought for over the last several decades had been for naught. So instead, they're buying time while trying to figure out what the next moves should be. But one thing is clear. They need more munitions, and they need them badly. Israel's air warfare last fall took out enormous amounts of their stockpiles. Ground raids into Lebanon captured even more. So degraded is the group today that Lebanon's government is even demanding they disarm, something Hezbollah is so far refusing to do. From Tehran's perspective, the situation is even more dire. Before the October 7th attacks, it was generally believed that Israel would fare poorly in a direct confrontation with Iran because of the impact that its proxies could have in response. Their failure to deliver on that strategy doesn't invalidate the logic behind it. Just try a simple thought experiment, okay? Think back to the confusion and panic of October the 7th, the way the surprise attack caught Israel's security services so off guard that it took agonizing hours to mount a serious response. Well, now imagine this generational shock had been accomplished by a simultaneous volley of missiles from Iran, Lebanon, and Yemen, a volley far bigger than anything Iran was able to muster during the recent 12-day war, one perhaps accompanied by a ground invasion from Lebanon. In this scenario, it's hard to imagine an outcome where the death toll on October the 7th wouldn't have been many times worse, where the shock and chaos reverberating through Israeli society wouldn't have felt near apocalyptic. Well, this such a thing was meant to be Tehran's plan for any war, the massive deterrent intended to keep Israel at bay. The reason it didn't play out like this was because after Hamas launched a massive attack, Israel responded by choosing to dismantle this axis of resistance piece by piece without drawing the other big players into the fray until it was too late. The fact that Iran has moved to resupply its proxies so quickly then should be a clear sign that the military strategy of strength through proxies has not fared well. And yet bringing these groups back up to military readiness is going to be an uphill battle. Just getting the weapons to these groups has turned into something of a headache for Tehran, something it never needed to worry much about before. Prior to the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Iranian planes could land in Damascus and link up with trucks that would take their weapon stashes straight to Hezbollah. Now, Syria's new government is actively hunting down Iranian smugglers. They want nothing to do with Tehran's smuggling activities and are instead attempting to show the international community, with varied success, that they are a sovereign state. Just last month, for example, Syrian forces caught a truck with Russian anti-tank missiles hidden under cucumbers heading into Lebanon. In May, they stopped Iranian air defense missiles near the border. For years, Lebanon's military largely ignored Hezbollah's weapons flowing across the border, a stance that could be partially attributed to the country's extremely weak government. Now, however, Lebanese forces have started intercepting these shipments with the help of Israeli intelligence. Still, the Axis is trying its hardest to adapt. Intelligence sources say Hezbollah have restructured their smuggling network and are building their own drones, though they still need Iranian parts. And they're learning from each bust, finding new ways to move gear in smaller pieces. And the risks here are steep. Israel has made it clear that if Hezbollah gets serious about rearming, they will start hitting them again. And that's before we even get to the growing tensions between Hezbollah and the official Lebanese army. For their part, the Houthis have consistently shown the least restraint of any of the members of the Axis of Resistance, and with more sophisticated weaponry, they could significantly worsen shipping through the Red Sea, a vital shipping channel through which much of the world's commerce flows. To be clear, Hezbollah is nowhere near ready to engage in any sort of conflict with Israel, or even to provoke Israeli strikes on the scale of last autumn. Nor are the Houthis about to become a more far-reaching threat with brand new superweapons or anything like that. But we nevertheless are seeing that Iran learned real lessons from its war with Israel, lessons which emphasize rather than de-emphasize the importance of proxy forces for their own domestic security, lessons which have compelled them to start rearming and rebuilding their proxies as fast as possible. and that will be keeping the whole region and broader world on edge. Because while the risk of a wider Middle East war may have died down for now, the circumstances in which another conflagration could erupt are already starting to grow. And finally, we turn to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where amidst lots of diplomatic fanfare and high-minded discussions of peace, the Congo, Rwanda, the United States, and quite a few other nations are ready to declare victory in ending an intense civil conflict. But as sometimes can be the case here on WarFronts, we've unfortunately got to play spoiler and explain that at least right now, any claim of true peace in the Congo just cannot survive scrutiny. Let's start with the reasons that so many world leaders are optimistic about the Congo's situation and the justification they've got for claiming that the nation has settled into a truce. As regular viewers of the Situation Room or regular geopolitics observers will already know, the Congo has been fighting a years-long war against an internal insurgent group known as M23, located in the nation's east and predominantly along the border with Rwanda. M23 is widely understood to be backed by Rwanda's leaders and its military, and with the help of thousands of uniformed Rwandan troops, M23 has taken over the entire border with Rwanda and the bulk of two provinces, North Kivu and South Kivu, along with their capital cities Goma and Bukavu, respectively. With control over those provinces, M23 can take over the production of various lucrative and important minerals, especially coltan, which can then be smuggled into Rwanda and sold off at a premium. Now, the DRC and the nation of Rwanda signed a peace deal several weeks ago, brokered by the United States, and meant to end the fighting that's torn the eastern Congo apart. But as we explained at the time, this deal came with a number of problems, primarily that it didn't directly involve M23 and thus didn't bind M23 to any actual agreement. Although M23 is understood to be a proxy group operating on behalf of the Rwandan government, all proxy groups have goals and incentives that can differ from those of their international sponsor, and without M23 actually signing on to the deal or agreeing to its terms, there was no guarantee that the fighting would actually stop. Not to mention, Rwanda categorically denies any allegation of involvement in the M23 conflict, meaning that by agreeing to not engage in hostilities toward the DRC, Rwanda was just agreeing to continue doing what it claimed to have been doing all along. Nor did the deal account for the role of other militia groups all across the Congo, where some groups fight beside government forces, but over 100, beyond just M23, oppose Kinshasa. In practice, the US-brokered deal mostly serves to clear the way for a surge of anticipated American investment into both the DRC and Rwanda, allowing Washington to strengthen its grip on the Congo's critical mineral resources. The really important talks to watch were a separate series of negotiations between the Congo and M23 directly, brokered by the nation of Qatar and held in the capital city of Doha. These were the first series of direct talks between the Congo and M23 since 2022, and while it's been very slow going for a wide range of reasons, the talks have been making progress. This past week, the Doha negotiations made headlines across the globe for what was represented across many news outlets as a real end to the fighting between M23 and the Congo for good. Unfortunately, however, even the briefest look at the fine print reveals that this is simply not the case. What the Congo and M23 agreed to this week wasn't a truce, but a so-called Declaration of Principles. That is to say, a preliminary agreement that basically says that both sides would like to work toward the establishment of a peace deal, but that falls many miles short of being a peace deal in itself. Under the terms of the deal, the Congo and M23 will commit to, quote, building trust through an exchange of prisoners, a return of federal authorities to areas that M23 controls, and other measures meant to restore a sense of normalcy. Under the terms of the deal, M23 and the Congo do commit to signing a peace deal no later than August the 18th, but that deal hasn't been signed at the time of writing, and the full terms of a real peace deal haven't even been agreed yet. On its face, the simple fact that this agreement doesn't establish a truce in the eastern Congo should be a problem in itself. Not only do the parties involved have barely a month to engage in rushed prisoner exchanges and figure out a way to get federal authorities back to North and South Kivu, but they still have to hammer out the terms of a final agreement, and that is going to be a problem. Already, it's become clear that M23 and Kinshasa have starkly divergent understandings of what they've currently agreed to, with M23 officials claiming that their group doesn't have to withdraw from any territory and has instead been given a mechanism to more smoothly integrate the essential functions of federal Congolese government into an autonomous, rebel-controlled zone. The Congo spokespeople, however, have indicated that the agreement calls for a, quote, non-negotiable withdrawal of M23 before Congolese officials and soldiers deploy into North and South Kivu provinces. That's not just a minor misunderstanding. It sets up a large-scale confrontation and showdown between M23 and Kinshasa that must be played out before a final peace deal could be signed. Nor is that confrontation avoidable, since the task of returning federal Congolese officials to Goma and Bukavu will be impossible to complete if both sides can't come to an understanding. And with the positions of M23 and the Congolese government so starkly divergent, it does not appear likely that either side would agree to each other's understanding of the situation. Now, it's not yet clear whether M23 and Kinshasa might genuinely intend to avoid any fighting while this preliminary agreement is in effect, and to be clear, that is a possibility. But at least right now, there's a reason to believe that M23 and the Congo will continue to engage in hostilities despite what they've agreed to in the Qatar negotiations. After the Congo and Rwanda signed the deal, M23 and Congolese soldiers continued to skirmish frequently on the fringes of M23's captured territory, and during that same time, the Congo shot down a plane headed to a rebel-controlled airstrip, despite M23's claims that it was carrying humanitarian aid. Not only that, but in early July, both M23 and the Congolese military appeared to reinforce their positions in and around the conflict zone, particularly near South Kivu, where the federal government flew in hundreds of troops and took up positions across the frozen battle lines. Both sides are poised to start fighting again in case something goes haywire, and with so many points of potential conflict over the next few weeks, even small skirmishes or misunderstandings could very quickly lead to an exchange of fire across the entire front line. Nor do either M23 or the Congolese government seem inclined to grit their teeth and accept each other's demands for the sake of preventing further bloodshed. For M23, although it would be great from an outside perspective if they were to vacate Goma, Bukavu, and other populated areas, it's difficult to see how that would work in a practical sense. Right now, there's no clarity on whether M23 fighters could get some sort of amnesty deal worked out with Kinshasa, or whether they could otherwise be allowed to exist unbothered in some way, and without those assurances, M23 has no reason to give up its defensible positions in urban areas. To walk away without real guarantees would mean that thousands of M23 fighters are supposed to just disappear into the jungle, with no reason to be confident that the Congolese forces wouldn't just start trying to hunt them down once they're in areas where the international press can't follow. M23 has also continued fighting against independent militias, known as Wazalendos, who aren't likely to abide by the terms of a peace deal the government agrees to, meaning that by abandoning their fortified zones, M23 would throw away key advantages against an opponent that will probably continue to attack it. And for the Congolese government, allowing M23 to retain control over North and South Kivu would be untenable for several reasons at once. Not only would that grant Rwanda long-term de facto control over the Congo's territory and some of its richest mineral deposits, but it would give other armed militant groups in Congo reason to believe that if they too can conquer a patch of territory and hold it, then the government will agree to give them a degree of autonomy. That would be a non-starter for any number of world governments dealing with separatist or autonomous movements, and the Congo's no different. Plus, if the Congo does grant amnesty deals to M23 fighters, then it'll allow the perpetrators of systematic extrajudicial executions, mass sexual abuse of women and children, and a range of other war crimes and atrocities to simply walk free across the nation. And any fragile balance that the Congo and M23 can achieve could still be upset by the chaos emanating from a completely different conflict in a completely different part of the Congo. In the nation's Ituri province, the Islamic State Central Africa franchise, known in the Congo as the Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, are growing in power and carrying out mass casualty attacks with some frequency. The nation of Uganda borders Ituri province and has launched a large-scale offensive against the ADF jihadists, broadening an ongoing military campaign against what Uganda alleges are anti-Ugandan militias that hide on Congolese soil. Recently, a joint Ugandan and Congolese military force attacked the ADF in a district near a major highway at the jihadist so-called Medina camp, where they're at their very strongest. But although Uganda and the Congo have been able to push the ADF away from the terrain where they've been based for years, they haven't been able to gain any decisive advantage. Instead, Islamic State fighters have disappeared en masse into the bush, or where they've kept up attacks on Congolese civilians while conducting asymmetric guerrilla warfare against the governments trying to hunt them down. Uganda, too, takes advantage of the conflict in a similar way to Rwanda's involvement with M23, although the zones where Ugandan troops are located are rich in gold and valuable timber instead of the mineral coltan. With the ADF running wild across Ituri province and Uganda cementing its own hold on lucrative smuggling networks to harvest the Congo's resources, the backdrop of any Congo M23 deal will be one of much broader instability. Even if these two sides can agree to a peace, which is far from guaranteed at this stage, then the deal will take effect in a nation that's still near the precipice. Thank you for watching.